Hey, Jordan with TYT. We're here at Radio Row in New Hampshire, Manchester, and I'm here with John Nichols, who has been with The Nation for a long time, one of the journalists that I actually look to coming up. I wanted to start. The Nation endorsed Senator Sanders.
It sure did.
It's a lonely voice in the media circles of high-profile
actually,
places.
I think the Council Bluffs paper did, and
okay.
I hope I don't have it wrong.
Yeah.
No, you're exactly right, and that should not surprise anyone. I've written a lot of books about media over the years, and one of the big stories that I've covered for all of my adult life has been trade policy. And I remember when the NAFTA debate was going on back in 93, 94, particularly 93. It was a critical struggle. America was divided 50-50 on it. I mean, there was clearly a deep divide. Majority of Democrats in the House and many Republicans opposed it. Substantial portion of Republicans, majority of Dems. Just this huge opposition. And yet, of all the newspapers in America, there's like 2 or 3 that opposed it, out of well over 1,000. And similarly with China free trade, a tiny number that opposed it. This is the thing we need to understand. When you go to core structural economic issues, when you are really talking about the heart and soul agenda of Wall Street and multinational corporations, you are going to see most of your media draw back, even your liberal media. The reason that happens is not because they're unconcerned and not because I wish I could make it some conspiracy. It's not that. What it is there's sort of a rarefied air that they breathe, right? And they actually, in many cases, believe that a neoliberal agenda is all that's possible. I mean, it literally is, Thatcher won. And she won with her line, the famous line, Tina, there is no alternative. I mean, and newspaper and many magazine editorial boards literally operate in that painfully narrow zone.
The Young Turks has done a lot on the Clinton News Network, CNN, which I saw a segment last week with Carol Costello interviewing Susan Sarandon. And I had interviewed Susan Sarandon the night before. And it was amazing. I mean, you might as well have just cut out everything but the amount of time she said, but. But he's a socialist.
You know what, Ms. Sarandon, you're a feminist icon. Hillary Clinton is running as a feminist icon, so why aren't you supporting her? Bernie Sanders, he says he's a socialist. He admitted that he would have to raise taxes to accomplish his goals. The critics would say, he wants to give Americans handouts, single payer. He wants everybody to have health insurance. Some countries within Europe, their economies aren't so great.
It seems to me that the media is kind of focused a lot more on being talent show judges, who's up, who's down, rather than what is socialism, why does it work in other countries, how could it work here, maybe it can't work. But in terms of the actual establishment, we speak with a lot of Democratic voters around the country. I'm getting a new slogan that's kind of no, we can't. The Hillary voter is saying in a liberal utopia, we'd love Bernie. But here's what can really get done.
Bernie Sanders already said, he wants a revolution. He wants a revolution. Well, I don't really want a revolution. I want a president.
I don't hear a lot of meat on the bone why Bernie's policies can't get done.
That's a really good question. And you of course, did the most dangerous thing of all questioners, which is you threw in about 7 good questions. So as a person being interviewed by you, I can answer any of the 7. And so follow up on the ones I don't answer here. But I think that at the risk of sounding like it's saying, going too far for one side or the other in all this, right? Let me tell you that I think that there is a lot of arguments that Hillary Clinton could make for herself as a candidate. And I think she's done, I've actually heard her on the trail the last few days, and she's done pretty well. The incredible thing is, not even that comes across. Not even when she's actually making a very strong, coherent argument for herself. All that comes across in most of our media is an absurd horse race. And along with it, these are the parallels, the horse race and then the policing. And it's a fascinating thing because this is literally what we're dealing with. We're dealing with a media that says, here's who's ahead, here's catching up, here's what's possible 8 months from now. 7 months, 8 months, 9 months from now. Here's what's possible at the end of the year. And you don't fit into that. So from the very beginning, you're dismissed. But if you get close enough to upset that, then you see a huge pushback saying it's almost as if it's like a Wizard of Oz thing. They're saying this can't be happening. This is unreal. And so we're going to challenge what you're saying rather than pause and say, you know what? You have upset this whole thing. You've disrupted this whole thing. And maybe we should examine why that is the case. And the interesting thing is, this is where the media often becomes a defining player in our politics. Not an observing player, not an influencing player, but a defining player. Because if we were to accept the notion that Hillary Clinton, like many candidates throughout history, including FDR, could dramatically improve in the course of this race, right? Could become a better and better candidate. And I've covered politics forever. Every candidate gets better during the course of a campaign. And they take elements from their opponents. They learn from the process. They grow. Franklin Delano Roosevelt was not elected as Franklin Delano Roosevelt as we know him, but he ran against Norman Thomas, the Socialist Party candidate. Do you know what Roosevelt did a couple months after being elected? He invited Norman Thomas to the White House and said, we're dealing with this Great Depression. This is a really challenging situation. What are your ideas, Norm? And Roosevelt actually took some notes, and Thomas had some pretty good ideas, like Social Security. And what I'm saying is, a media that actually covered politics would be covering that dynamic, would be recognizing not merely the significance of what Sanders said, the necessity to explain what Sanders is saying to us, which is very, very important, and it is an expanding of our discourse. But it would also be covering how Hillary Clinton, how people around her are responding to that and maybe growing. This is an important thing that we lose, and it's on both sides of our politics, by the way, because as Ron Paul comes along, even Rand Paul, who at points in this campaign actually, well, he wasn't as purist on some of the libertarian stuff as his dad, was bringing some interesting stuff in. I mean, it was just, those ideas were just pushed to the side. The only thing they listened to him on at all was, did he challenge Donald Trump? Did he do this stuff? And so that's the policing thing. It isn't purely ideological. You know what it is? It's fascinating for something we call media, something that we, in some ways think of as not just news but entertainment. It polices things to keep them dull. It literally pushes in the parameters to keep it as narrow as possible.
Well, maybe I'm more cynical. Let's throw Fox News out. So just CNN, MSNBC,
Sure.
Some of these digital sites run by very wealthy publishers.
Sometimes.
But, I mean, you have on both sides fairly wealthy TV news anchors. You have former, Chris Matthews worked in Congress.
Well, that's an interesting.
Who, on one end, I'm not saying they are conservative, but I am saying they're kind of removed from what everyday people. Morning Joe gets that criticism.
Well, Morning Joe's been interesting though, because in some ways Joe Scarborough has been kind of.
He's been a little more liberal these days.
It's been complex where he's come from, and all that I ask, I don't expect anybody to ideologically agree with me. It'd be fun, but all that I ask is that people be a little bit curious about this whole thing. Mm-hmm. And if it's something interesting's happening, check it out, right? And also, one of the great challenges, Zephyr Teachout, who's running for Congress in New York and who ran against Cuomo in the primary in 2014, is one of the great thinkers on reform and opening up our politics. She says, come on, people, you got to stop being pundits. She says, believe in what you believe in. Have faith in what you have faith in, and try and respond to what is real to you and what has meaning to you. You're going to actually understand what's going on much better, right? And I think this is what's happened here. Our media has become pure punditry.
Yeah.
Right? Now,
it's also cheaper for them.
Well, it's much cheaper because you don't have to. Yeah. But here's the interesting thing about pure punditry. It excludes getting excited about things. It excludes actually getting interested, really interested in something. And what I would suggest to you is, we need the pundits. Absolutely. It's totally great. Great to have pundits. There's nothing wrong with that. But it's also for the discourse healthy to have people who are observers, be they on the left, the right, even the center, who are enthusiastic about something. That makes for a better discussion. And in much of the world, that's how it operates.
They say this. I mean, you watch Sunday shows over the last 20 years. Have you
seen
appeared
on some of them?
Have you seen many young people?
Have
you seen many young people? Have you seen many people that weren't a strategist or?
Yeah, well, that's the conundrum. And it's a very funny thing. I was on Meet the Press last summer with Pat Buchanan. And we're talking about populism, which is something I've written a lot about. Pat Buchanan has been a part of. And, it was a fascinating discussion. And we totally disagreed deeply disagreed about a lot of stuff. I give Chuck Todd credit because, it was actually a pretty good discourse. But it was an interesting thing because, at the start of the discussion, there was an effort to suggest, as often is the case, that populism on the right, populism on the left was the same thing. Right, and so these are there's a stream happening that Trump and Sanders, all this was the same, and I said no. Look, I think that, to my mind, that radically misses the reality of our times, and it's painful. It's painful realities of our times. But we live in silos. We have siloed ourselves. So a populism on the right is informed by an immense amount of information, immense amount of ideas fed by right-wing media, right? A populism on the left is also fed by an immense number of ideas, less fed by media in that case than by movements, new movements that have developed. Fight for 15, Black Lives Matter, the long-term fight on trade policy, some long-term fights on military-industrial complex, peace, stuff like that. Now, as we become more siloed, segmented, our populism is informed deeply by a lot of experience, a lot of input. And so I don't think that there's a parallel between Trump and Sanders. I think they are really, really going in fundamentally different directions. The only thing that's common is they are tapping into an anger that exists on the right and that exists on the left. Why does that anger exist?
And one anger, I would say, based on the people I've met, has a lot of racial undertones under it, while another is angry at plutocrats and corporate welfare.
Yeah, and you see, I don't think this is an interesting dynamic here, because it's really a question of, I think there's economic underpinning to a lot of it, but it's a question of who you blame, right?
And values.
Where do you point the finger of blame, right?
Right.
Do you point it at the person next to you, right? Or maybe somebody you believe is a step below you on the economic ladder, or do you point it up, right? Jim Hightower always says, it's not a left-right fight, it's an up-down fight.
Right.
And there's simply no question that in this election cycle, by and large, now I've covered some Republicans who are quite interesting in this, so I think Republicans have a diversity in their field that is not often explored. But basically, on the Republican side, on the right, it is blame someone for our problems.
Yep.
And who do you want to blame? Oh, well, we can blame immigrants. Donald Trump has done a lot of that, and so have his fellow candidates. You can blame Muslims. And Cruz has been horrific on this, and several of the other candidates. Rubio really bad on some of the things he's said.
You could blame Planned Parenthood.
You blame Planned Parenthood, although if we noticed the Republican debate the other night, two of the Republicans, Christie and Bush, were attacking Rubio for being too extreme on abortion. Well, what was going on there?
I tweeted about that.
Their purism suddenly is out the window when they realize they're in a state that is more economically conservative than socially. And so, but the problem, it's still this thing of blaming someone, desperately blaming someone, anyone else. Now, usually the Democrats have been just lousy at creating an alternative to that, like saying, no, that's absurd to blame an immigrant. It's absurd to blame a religious minority, a racial minority, an ethnic minority. It's absurd to blame, people who provide basic health care services to women. That is absurd. It's absurd to blame women. It's absurd, to blame gays and lesbians, right? That's crazy when you see this real fundamental reality of multinational corporations that game so many of the things in our lives. But Democrats haven't usually said that. They've often been, sort of like soft managerial players. This is what Sanders has brought into this thing. And I'm not here to tell people to vote for Sanders or to vote against him. That's for people to decide. And they can decide based on, the dangers of the time, the elective, whatever they want to debate. That's fine. But what I'm saying is, what Sanders has inserted into this thing is is a counter-argument to the right. A genuine counter-argument. Now, I believe, again, no matter who you're supporting, no matter what you think about all this, I believe that counter-argument is so powerful, so influential, that Hillary Clinton, who is not a person of the left, is practically saying, "Wow, that's significant. But
is she really evolving?
I don't know.
Or is she making political calculus?
You know what? I can't read people's minds, but I can tell you that in the history of this country, I'm not making a case for Clinton or a case for Sanders. That's not my point. I can tell you history is pretty instructive on this because, going back to the founding of this country, at the founding of this country, my man was Tom Paine. I was with Tom Paine. He was a good guy, in my view. A lot of the rest of them, very dissatisfied. But you know what? Paine wrote Common Sense. It really struck something. And suddenly all these other people are like, you know what? Let's go there. Similarly, founding of the Republican Party, which was a great party. Republican Party, fabulous.
Lincoln, yep.
Influenced by people who said, vote yourself a farm, right? The Homestead Act. I mean, this is very radical stuff. And, founding the Republican Party, these are a lot of people who are really out on the fringes politically. And, a lot of the people who were kind of vaguely anti-slavery, vaguely good on Homestead, stuff like that. They said, okay, we're going with that, right? You know what I mean? Same with the progressive movement. Same with Roosevelt. Roosevelt, a son of privilege, elected really as a very centrist Democrat, saw the moment, evolved to it. Lyndon Johnson, who was not a good player, right? Where do we get civil rights, voting rights, Medicare, Medicaid, all this other stuff? Richard Nixon, right? EPA, Clean Water Act, Clean Air Act, expansion of public housing, just a long list of stuff. Why do these people do this? Do they do it because they suddenly became good people? Or do they do it because movements that had been around, but often not connected, got connected politically and forced a message in? I think that's the moment we are in. Now, I don't know how far Sanders goes. I don't know what, that's for the pundits. And I respect, people going to chart their polls. What I'm going to tell you is I think that Sanders has inserted into the discourse this counter notion to the power of the economic elites. And my sense is that is something that could be transformative politically, even on people who don't want to go there. Right? You know what I mean?
Right.
That at a certain point, it's like, hold it, I got to do that. And here's what I found that's fascinating. I did a piece in The Nation this week about all sorts of congressional candidates around the country who are stepping up, who are taking these messages into the game. Zephyr Teachout running in New York State. I think it's Flores running out in Nevada. Several of these other
Black Lives Matter
running in Baltimore.
Activist is running in Baltimore. Yeah.
And this is the interesting thing. On the left, there's often a discourse. So people say, well, I don't like electoral politics. I like, grassroots activism in the streets, at the gates of power, And people, it's like, oh, these must be separate things, right? Often they are. But we are taught that they are separate, right? We are told that they are separate, and we learn that they are separate because there's so much money. The elites are so powerful. They influence both parties so greatly that we think, well, electoral, it doesn't work. Boy, the second you prove to people that electoral might work, then you suddenly realize how many state legislative seats in this country are there? Thousands. How many county jobs, city jobs that have real power over how people's lives are affected? Tens of thousands. What if all these activists started running for those things? Well, you know where that happened most recently? On the right, right? Ralph Reed and the religious right said there is a social conservative way to do a water board. Run for the water board, run for the school board, run for anything, run for Congress, run for president. And a lot of people did. They taught their people to take their movement energy right into the power structure, right into it. What I think is happening now is that is being explored. Now, if Sanders is completely shut down, if it doesn't work, could there be an immense disillusion? Yeah, that's the danger. But you know what? I think it's always pretty interesting when the things start to get opened up, when it starts to get blown apart. And our politics going into 2016 was so awful, so indefensible, so nightmarishly narrow,
right,
that I would go so far. A friend of mine who's a former state rep, former gubernatorial candidate here in New Hampshire, Arnie Arneson, very, very savvy person. She said to me last night, she said, I think this is the Occupy election.
Really?
Yeah. That Occupy energy, which was a huge deal. Occupy occurred in New York. We all know that.
Yeah.
But in my mom's hometown of Burlington, Wisconsin, she and her fellow folks did occupy the theater, and for every Thursday night or something, they showed radical films. You know what I mean? Or progressive films, Michael Moore, even, stuff like that. But the fact is, it got out to small town Wisconsin.
Right.
It was real.
It was
that
throughout
movement,
the country, yeah.
Yeah. And it was fabulously interconnected, and people actually understood what they were doing. Imagine if that marched into our politics. I mean, you start to get a shiver, right? You're like, whoa.
Well, my last question is, Bernie is up against the banks.
Yeah.
Bernie's up against the pharmaceutical companies.
Sure.
Bernie's up against the media. And he's also up, from what I'm seeing more and more, I wouldn't even call them establishment. I would call them the status quo Democrats. Sure. How does one take the movement he's been creating, a lot of young people, and move that and evolve that from influencing the discussion to winning a general nomination?
Very, very good. So you're thinking if he actually got the nomination?
I think if he won the nomination, I think it's a very good case he would become president. Because if he won the nomination, you would have to think he beat the Clinton machine, and he might have the same type of movement as a then Senator
Well, you're
Barack
doing better
Obama.
punditry than I ever will.
I try.
But let me offer you this notion. Again, I usually, when somebody throws a good bit of punditry at me, and I want to give you your award here, I usually come back with history, because I like history. Now, that's kind of, it's a dodge, let's be honest. Because history, we evolve, right? So history doesn't always tell us stuff. But it sometimes gives us examples and ideas that might be valuable. So, here's the deal. In 1964, Barry Goldwater ran for president. And conscience of a conservative, he was what conservatives wanted, and they loved him. And he got wiped out, 39% of the vote, I believe. I hope I've got the figure right. Carried only a handful of southern states, basically. And I mean, it's just total wipeout. And the Democrats swept Congress a little bit like that. And everybody's like, well, conservatism just doesn't sell. America's not going to buy that thing. The Republican Party itself was like, ixnay on the conservatives, right? 16 years pass. Not a very long amount of time, actually, in history. 16 years pass. Ronald Reagan's coming along. That old spin was still there, right? That conservatism can't work. And they would say, oh, well, Reagan, it just can't work. Can't happen, right? And Republicans were terrified. The Republican establishment was. But Reagan lost narrowly in 76, then came back in 80. Kept talking about conservatism, talking about it in different ways, in new ways, connecting it more to real problems of people's lives, not just theoretical. Talking about American history, connecting it well to elements of American history. Whether he was right or not is not the point. He stole Tom Paine from me, but he played the game. So he did all this. 1980, he won, and he swept in a Republican Senate. This is a huge transformational election.
Right.
And here's the interesting thing. Instead of presuming that the ideological candidate cannot win, the question you must ask is, and knowing that everything's going to be thrown at them, every negative, every attack, you accept that. And whoever the Democratic nominee is going to get hit with a lot of attacks. If you think, okay, the question you ask is, does this person know how to explain this thing in a way? Do they know how to communicate in a new way? And that's a big question. Don't get casual about it. Don't think Bernie Sanders can do it. That's ask that question hard.
I think he's been too on the same message. I think he needs to change up his stump speech a little bit.
And that's what I'm saying. So one ought not be casual about this, because we're talking about big deal stuff here.
Right.
So the question is, could Bernie Sanders do what Reagan did? Now our conservative friends would laugh that off and say, oh, how. Well, Reagan was dismissed as an actor, as an ideologue, as somebody who's too far out. I mean, he got hit with everything, and he won it. He won a majority, and it was transformational politically, I think, for the bad, but it was. So if we look at our history seriously, then the answer to your question is there. It's just, are you talking about Goldwater, or are you talking about Reagan? Similarly, are you talking about Robert M. La Follette in 1924? Brilliant progressive campaign. Are you talking about Franklin Roosevelt, 1932, 1936? By 36, Roosevelt running as progressive, in many ways, very parallel to what La Follette was, winning the biggest landslide in modern American history. These are the questions we should ask ourselves as we analyze what's going on. And the one thing you shouldn't do, and I'd say this to Clinton backers, to Sanders backers, people who reject both these and say they're going to go with Jill Stein, the Greens, wherever people want to go. Say, don't talk yourself out of the possibility, right? If conservatives had talked themselves out of the possibility of Reagan, right, You'd eternally be in Gerald Ford or something like
Right.
that. I don't know. So I think we're at a big deal point. And the last thing I'll tell you is, I think the future is profound. I think what's coming with a digital and automation revolution that is every bit as sweeping as the Industrial Revolution. We're already in the midst of it. It's going to cause massive dislocation. It's going to change our economic lives, our social lives. It already has. Many of us live in our phones now, right? It's going to do all these changes. These are radical, fundamental shifts. And it's at moments like that that countries change as well. Sometimes they change a lot for the worse, especially with a lot of dislocation. People get scared, they do bad things. But they can also change a lot for the better. And I think that I would ask people to forget about the candidates, forget about the parties, forget about the election itself. Look to that future and just ask, who would I want to have power? Who would I want to have in power in that future? And understand that people watching this show may be highly politically engaged, like, separated out to do that. But just understand, they're probably working people that don't watch the Young Turks every night and don't, who are feeling that too. And if you figure out how to communicate that you want a future where there's somebody in power who cares about them, that's all. No complex agenda. Just in that very scary, very profound moment of change, there's somebody there who actually is thinking about you. Mm-hmm. That's transformative, man. That's real politics. That's politics, not elections.
I will conclude with this, and I won't even ask for a commission. You need to create your own podcast if you don't have one already. That is mix of history, motivational speaking, and whatever else you want, because that was fantastic. And I really appreciate you taking the time.
Well, I'm honored, and I love what you guys do. I really appreciate it. I've seen a lot of profound stuff coming out of you. And rather than do a podcast, I just like to interview me anytime. We'll go together. We'll go off together, brother.
Terrific.
All right, man. That's the whole point.
Great.
All right.
Thanks, man.